Hello, everyone. My name is Zack Hallock, Energy Services Advisor at Competitive Energy Services. For this edition of CES University, we're going to talk demand response. Specifically, I'm going to cover demand response in the ISO New England market. And in fact, right now is a very savvy time to talk demand response as we're about to start this upcoming power year, as well as the summer season. But first, I'm going to run through our agenda for today. I'm going to cover the ISO New England capacity market as it relates to what ISO does. I'm going to go through Demand Response 101, bring those of you who are unfamiliar up to speed, and really talk about how these dispatch zones are significant and impact your performance in the market. And along with that, I'm going to go over the programs. Really think about it in two buckets in terms of revenue generating programs. You have your ISO directed program, as well as your utility directed program, often known as connected solutions. I'm going to bring in the notion of CES Self-Help as a complementary package, and then I'm going to roll it all up into one as we look at the value stack of these three programs combined. To really dive into it, let's talk ISO New England. Now, we know that ISO New England administers the wholesale energy market, which really consists of three major buckets. Your energy market, that's the actual commodity itself. You have your day ahead and real-time markets. And that's really what the basis of the conversation is when we look to make those hedges. Now, ISO also administers and services the ancillary market, and that addresses regulation, support, reserve margin, as well as those other services to do all of this work. But what I'm going to focus about today is the capacity market. And this, in its simplest form, ensures the grid has sufficient resources to meet future demands. Now, a little bit more about the capacity market, if you're not familiar, the premise is all around reliability. The market functions 3 years ahead. It's a reverse auction format, and the low bid in that reverse auction serves as the clearing price paid to all generators. And the money for those generators comes from you, the ratepayer, which all circles around your contribution to the grid on the peak day. I'll get into that a little bit more, but we've also touched on that in our prior installments of CES University. Something that's really important to consider here with this declining capacity value are some of the challenges really built around this New England grid that we have. We all know that the New England grid has got some serious hurdles to really identify and really attack these challenges that are coming down the grid with electrification and kind of the changing grid mix. And as you can see, we have a fair amount of resources that are either closed within the last 5 to 10 years or teed up to close within the next 5 years. And so it's not easy to predict the future demand on the grid. And on top of that, we don't really have long duration storage, and we don't have a really quick timeline for any of these really reliable resources. And in fact, a common touted statistic is that roughly the top 7% of grid stress hours constitute 25% or more of the total cost to maintain that reliability and safety on the grid. And so just to kind of establish that we really do need to do our best job at curtailing those peak hours. And that's really the basis for why demand response exists. The whole idea is to avoid those hours as best we can, or to mitigate the actual severity of those hours. And so that's where we introduce dispatch zones. In a prior CES University video, we did cover the wholesale load zones in New England, which are tied in very closely with the forward capacity market. But a subset of that wholesale load zone marketplace are these dispatch zones. And it kind of makes sense when you look at it. Some of the smaller zones are centered around higher population and higher volatility areas in terms of potential shortfalls on the grid. Now, I'm going to introduce a term here called an aggregator. It's a third party separate from CES that actually goes out, and they've been approved by the ISO to provide these demand response participation opportunities. And they're separate from your grid operator or the utility, and they really handle your participation in the market to ensure that there is effective curtailment in place when those grid stress hours occur. And the table I have towards the bottom left of the slide here is actually the historical log of grid emergencies back to the year 2010. And as you can see, they've become much less frequent over the last half of the decade. In fact, we've only had 2 real grid emergencies since 2014. So you could say Murphy's Law, we're due for one, but again, the market's becoming more efficient and we are becoming better at curtailing these peak hours. And so therefore, we should avoid these emergency events more often. But again, you can't predict a sudden loss of a major generation asset, which would instigate a true grid emergency. Another term for the aggregators is called curtailment service provider, or CSP. I'll try to keep my terminology consistent, but often in the marketplace, you see this term come up. In fact, quite often. Something that you're looking at here, we've seen before. It's really just the value stack. Prior, when I was covering the basics of ISO New England, the energy markets are our component in blue there, and then our ancillaries and administrative adders are the small slivers you see in red and gray. Now, what I'm really focusing on here is the orange component, and what's unique about the orange component is the capacity is you have the ability to control that. It's something you can actually impact, whereas you just have to react to the market when it comes to energy, RPS, and really everything else in this value stack. So let's dive into the programs. I said there are 2 revenue generating programs and the single cost avoidance program in the CES Self-Help. Let's dive into this ISO directed revenue program. And really, you want to think about it in 2 buckets. You have your active demand capacity resources. That's really the generic, I'll use the term generic, program that most people consider. But really, there's another program that's on the passive side. But before I get into passive, let's cover the active program again. The active program, the participants are dispatched when wholesale electricity prices in New England are exceptionally high, or when there is an actual emergency. When those emergencies are occurring, that's when you get a 30-minute heads up notice. So it's a very tight timeline, but again, that does not happen often. So the idea being, when there's not an emergency, you still need to prove that your resources can show up when they're called. And so that's why we have an audit. There are 2 seasons, a summer and a winter season, April through November for the summer, winter is December and March. And you typically, if the summer audit falls in June, typically the winter audit falls in December, and you are actually given a week heads up before that audit occurs. So you are able to participate with a little bit more heads up than if it was a true grid emergency. And so in a generic sense, we think about this active demand capacity resource program as the audit program, and it's there for reliability for the grid when you are needed. I should note that in this program, you are paid quarterly within 60 days of your aggregator receiving the payment from the ISO. And so that's why the aggregator exists, because they are able to manage your capacity with the ISO. As a part of the value add, there's also the sheltering of any potential payments or any potential penalties, penalties for not performing. Right now, the downside is if you don't perform, you simply don't get the revenue. It's about as simple as that. Looking at the on-peak program, however, the passive program is a little bit different. That program is structured around alleviating grid stress for the on-peak hours, but really identifying those permanent load reductions. And so this is where technology actually comes into play. On-site distributed generation, a cogen, a CHP, behind the meter solar, fuel cell, those things are running during those peak hours during the respective season, and it's permanently displacing your otherwise demand on the grid. And so therefore, you're going to be rewarded for it because it's still reducing those peak hours for the ISO and for your local utility. And that fundamentally is why this program is quite unique relative to the standard demand response program, but it's a lot more nuanced and a lot more difficult to get into which is why we often have to take an extra step back and make sure that we have all of the boxes checked for compliance. Now, again, there is a winter season, but again, that's really only centered around the peak hours, which for the winter time in ISO New England tend to fall between the hours of 5 to 7, whereas in summer, it can range anywhere from 1 to 5 p.m. Occasionally can run past it, but the program is structured for 1 to 5. I should note that the passive as well as ADCR are expected to be 24/7, 365, which means you may need to be able to perform on the weekends. However, that's not necessarily always going to be the case. Anyways, I just wanted to alleviate any concerns around those programs, and let's dive into an actual event where someone responded. So this is an example of an audit, not an actual emergency event from August 6th, back in 2020, a customer was audited in the middle of the day from noon to 3. They were able to engage their BMS for load shed, and they were able to achieve a 2,000 kW load shed. I should say this is pretty exceptional performance. The average performance in New England is 400 kW. So this is quite a higher amount of revenue than what an average curtailment customer may see. However, the opportunity is still there and it should be pursued. The math is quite simple. You take your delivered kW reduction, you multiply that times the current capacity rate, which for this power year, 21 to 22, is $4.63. And based on that single audit event, this customer generated $74,000 in revenue. I'll get into more details on that in a second. Our other program, Utility Connected Solutions, is a little bit more nuanced, but generally the same rules apply. For Connected Solutions, the targeted dispatch program on the top here is really the program that most folks have access to. There are some caveats around daily dispatch, and that's mainly due to technology. But let me finish up with targeted first. So for targeted dispatch, this is really this is actually kind of unique. This program is just in its 5th year, so it hasn't existed nearly as long as the ISO directed program, which is why this is kind of a unique opportunity for some folks, because they may be familiar with the marketplace, but they may not be familiar with this program. And one of the key differences between Connected Solutions and the ISO directed programs is your baseline. Your baseline is based on a 10-day trailing average of weekdays. And that is significant because if you are actively shedding load every day, you could erode your baseline. And so it's important to understand what are my normal operations relative to a potential utility connected solutions call. These calls tend to run a little bit longer, and you do have a few calls because it's directed by the utilities local system peak, not so much the ISO directed region peak. And so you still have your 2 programs, summer during June through September, 2 to 7 p.m., and then winter from 2 to 7 p.m. So your hours that you're going to respond are consistent season to season, but they're also potentially longer calls, and you're going to have a few more. I should also note that in these programs, your performance is based on an average of all your calls. So with the ISO directed, you had the single event that was your response. With the utility, you have an average of all your calls. It's a double-edged sword because if you perform well on all of your calls, great. But if you miss a call, you're not going to get as much performance, but it also shelters you from receiving absolutely nothing. Some caveats with daily dispatch, still generally the same premise, but daily dispatch is more focused around these higher frequency of calls. And it's actually, I should get into the technology component because really not all utilities treat this program the same. In fact, everyone requires that you use only a battery for this program because a battery is incentivizing the use of clean technology to avoid these grid hours. However, National Grid in Massachusetts and Rhode Island also allow permitted generation as well as battery storage. So that's one unique opportunity for National Grid customers. I also want to point out the elephant in the room that with daily dispatch, the per unit value is almost 10 times the value of targeted dispatch. But again, there's a lot more hoops to jump through and a lot more caveats around daily dispatch. So again, even though it's an attractive program, it may not always be the best opportunity for you. So now that I've gone through our utility program, let's take another look at an example. So there was a utility call on July 27th from 4 to 7 p.m. 2020. This is a different customer now who utilized both on-site generation as well as their BMS load shed to drop their 2000 kW. Now, this is pretty unique here because this is also during the peak day. I'll get to that as it marries up with CES Self-Help. But what's significant is that the utility calls, because it has to do with your LDC, your local distribution company's stress, it's likely going to coincide with the ISO system peak. There are going to be other utility calls, but more often than not, these two calls intersect. And what's significant is this is a revenue generating event through your local utility. And this customer, oddly enough, generated about 70 grand in revenue just based on that single event. Now, it's a different calculus than the ISO directed program where you're getting the average of your events. But again, I'm just taking the hypothetical. This was the one-time call, and this is what that program would generate if they had performed 2000 kW on their single call, or if they did 2000 across the board on all of their calls. I just wanted to make that point clear because I'm kind of setting some lofty expectations for the revenue gained from these programs. So now that I've kind of established what we have for the revenue, let's layer in the cost avoidance and really get to this value stack. So, my good friend and colleague, Elliot Boyd, gave us a great rundown on CES Self-Help just a few weeks ago. It's an exclusive service to CES customers. We really dial in our notification system to not flood your inbox with potential warnings. And as I mentioned, this often coincides with those utility calls. And so it's a good way to verify not just the CES side of those notifications, but also the aggregator side of these notifications. And again, this peak day, this peak hour, all depends on, are we on a multi-day heat wave here? How's the humidity? How's the cloud cover? What's the time of day that this is occurring? And so on and so forth. So going back to our example where the customer performed that utility call on the peak day, let's look at the cost avoidance. And so for the cost avoidance component, they still achieved the 2000 kW reduction. In terms of calculating that, you actually have to go back to what is the market valuing my per unit kW, which is still $4.63. You do have to care about the reserve margin with ISO, which goes back to the ancillary services. And that essentially establishes that we do have excess supply in the market for those potential moments where demand exceeds our expectations. And so with the 27th being the peak day, they were able to avoid, if they were able to shed 2000 kW off their current cap tag, that in terms of avoided cost annually based on current year capacity rates is 160 grand, which is massive. It's more than the combined revenue of the two, the ISO and the utility programs. So this is really where the power and the true value of these programs in coinciding come into play here. And so let's take a quick moment to go through that value stack. Now, again, all of the programs that I just covered here, our CES Self-Help in blue up on the top, that's your cost avoidance. You have your targeted and daily dispatch. You can't be in both of the programs. It's either one or the other. So it's not like you can double up and get paid, 4 to 5 times off from one event. It's really, at best, you're going to get paid twice off one event, but it's also good to have the third layer of this value stack in there with your ISO directed program. And so now that we've kind of gotten our established baselines for these respective programs, let's look at the dollars and cents here. Let me take you through a couple changes from some of the revenue projections that I've just run through with you, mainly around the fact that I am taking into account winter performance here, whereas I was just showing you summer only performance. And on top of that, our curtailment service provider, AKA our aggregators, often require a revenue share agreement so that they can cover the administrative work on their end, the metering work on their end, the notifications, and if there are any potential penalties that they technically have to incur on your behalf, they are not going to pass that through. It rarely comes up in conversation because people always perform, but in the rare instance where this occurs, we need to be prepared. And so a 25, 75, 75 going to the customer is quite standard. Typically no dashboard, not performance, metering install, performance cap, none of that in this evaluation. And so taking the declining FCA rate, as you can see, as we walk down each power year down to, potentially out into 27, I do want to note real quick here, folks, as well, that my two columns to the right are grayed out ever so slightly. The capacity value has not been established yet. Earlier I mentioned we're 3 years out in the future. And so we're really only out into 24, 25 right now. And so those are just kind of estimates for what we think the dollars per kW value of capacity is for you. So let's get to the bottom line here. Based on this understood revenue share agreement, a 2,000 kW performance in the summer, a 1,000 kW performance in the winter, just taking our current year, June 21 to May 22, you would get roughly 71K in utility payment and 69K in ISO payment. Now, yes, these numbers are different from what I just told you, but again, I'm baking in the revenue share and the winter performance, which is why that attractive utility program is actually generating more revenue than I had previously said. So for a total annual curtailment payment coming in at 140 grand, that's only 2/3 of our value stack. If we layer in that 161K, now we're talking about roughly $300,000 in the upcoming year alone for potential combination of revenue and avoided cost coming back to your facility. And last time I checked, 300K raises eyebrows for anybody, no matter how large of a manufacturer or institution you are. And so that's really the value of incentivizing the combination of these two programs, along with the way in which you structure your electricity contract, which puts CES in a very, very attractive spot for you, because not only can we work hand in hand with these aggregators, with these curtailment service providers, but we're also working with you hand in hand on your electricity procurement. And so at that, I want to extend a brief thank you. I appreciate your time. Please reach out with any questions. I'm available between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Please give me a call. Check us out on YouTube, socials, connect with me on LinkedIn, and I look forward to hearing from you.